Haftarah for today, the prophetic reading from Zechariah. You may be familiar with the last lines, which are made famous by a song by a contemporary Jewish composer, Debbie Friedman. In the end, the angel is showing to Zerubbabel different signs, different symbols, and the angel said to me, "Do you not know what these are?" He said, "No, my Lord." And he spoke up to me saying, "This is the word of Adonai to Zerubbabel, not through armies, not through might, but through my spirit." Be familiar with the Hebrew, where it says, "Lo b'chayil, lo b'choach, ki'im biruchi, amar Adonai." Not by might, not my power, but rather through my spirit. Now, that has been a song that is sung, I would say, in my... Once Debbie Friedman made the song famous, I'm going to guess in the 1980s, it was sung in Jewish camps with the idea that we're anti-war or anti-violence, not by might, not by power, but only through God's Spirit. You know, as someone who grew up in the 60s and I saw peaceful demonstrations sometimes break out into violence demonstrations, the idea that we ought not resort to violence in our civil disputes with each other, it seems right. We should be a nonviolent society. But how did it get here? The theory is that after the Maccabean Revolution, there was an idea that the Jews could fight off the imperial powers. So, for example, the idea that when Rome was ruling Judea, that the Jews could fight off the Romans, and there was a very messianic dimension, that if the Romans are fought off, the Messiah will come. Of course, we had the Great Revolt of 67 to 70 CE. The revolt was put down. Jerusalem was destroyed. Many Judeans were slaughtered. Many were exiled. Many were enslaved. And so it had disastrous outcomes. And this is something that is connected with the Jewish messianism, meaning believing in the Messiah, that came out of the Hebrew Bible. So already you see in the contemporary thought that percolates up into the Mishnah, preserved in the Mishnah, which is composed 100 years later, but the teachings of the rabbis at that time were preserved and then later appeared in the Mishnah, the codification of Jewish tradition published around 220 CE. And it was anti-messianic. And one reason that the books of the Maccabees were banned from study, they're not part of the Hebrew Bible, they're not part of the Torah, obviously, and they were called Sfarim Chitzoniim, the external books, and they are in what is called the Apocrypha today. No original Hebrew version exists because only the Greek and the Latin were copied. I'm not saying you'd get in very great trouble if you were caught reading a book of Maccabees, but it was not something encouraged and more or less prohibited. Now, why was the book of Maccabees prohibited? Why did the rabbis not want the book of Maccabees studied? Because it would encourage people to go to war against the Roman Empire. Now, the next great revolt, you may know from your Jewish history, was the Bar Kokhba revolt, 132 to 135 CE. He was another messianic figure. There was a great belief in his time that had they won that war against the Romans, the Messiah would come. The Bar Kokhba revolt was put down with great severity, great loss of life. An area of Judea was more or less emptied out, and that's when the Romans named Judea Palestine. That's when they renamed Jerusalem, and they renamed many of the cities in the area in Roman names. For example, Shechem came to be called Neapolitan, meaning the new city, which became Nablus. So if you look at many of the names of biblical Jewish cities in the land of Israel, you'll see they had Romanized names, and the names were then Arabized. When the rabbis were choosing the prophetic readings for Hanukkah, they picked a reading that would say, as we saw today, lo b'koach, lo b'chayil, not by might, not by power, but your spirit alone. Meaning, when God wants to bring the Messiah, God will bring the Messiah. Let's stop picking wars with these great world empires and having our people slaughtered and our people exiled from the land. And that was more or less what you might call the spirit of the Jewish dealings with major world empires, was to try to get along, support the state as much as possible, keep ourselves to ourselves. On one hand, sometimes the others did not want much to do with us. You know, there was great anti-Judaism during the Christian period, but sometimes people got along very well. In any case, don't be martial. You may know that this began to break down in the pogroms of the late 1800s, early 1900s, and there were different Jewish defense groups that grew up that we have to be able to train ourselves to defend ourselves. That was part of the Zionist movement, that we have to get out of the increasing and raging anti-Semitism of Europe, go to the land of Israel. The Turks permitted the Jewish immigration. The British permitted Jewish immigration, and even there was a sense that we cannot be defenseless. We cannot rely on the British to defend us. You had Hashomer, the first Jewish defense group in the land of Israel, and then you had the Haganah, the Palmach, and all of that was the embryo of the Israeli army. So this idea, lo b'koach, lo b'chayil, not by might, not by power, in a way is no longer the mode of thinking, of course, of Israel. It was very strongly here because American Jews have mostly identified with the anti-war movement, Vietnam, anti-war in general, a kind of a reflexive anti-war movement. And I'm wondering now if, I know there are very strong Jewish groups that are anti-Zionist, pro-peace, and insist on a ceasefire now. They're very loud. I don't know if they actually represent those in America who identify as Jewish and certainly identify with Israel. Meaning, is this still our policy? Lo b'chayil, lo b'koach, not by might, not by power. Or are we realizing, especially what we see in the United States today, is there a room for Jewish might and Jewish power even here? And that I would obviously say yes. I mean, when I read that Jewish students, I forget at which school, were boxed into a library by raging protesters outside, and I just imagine these young people just frightened to death. And the police came through some other way, and they snuck them out through the basement. But the idea that the Jewish students are simply just not equipped, spiritually, emotionally, certainly physically, to deal with the rage of people that could turn violent at any time. So I'm one of those who thinks, I don't have a plan, I don't have something to suggest, but I think that part of Jewish education should be Krav Maga, should be Jiu-Jitsu, should be self-defense, that one does not live one's life in fear that an anti-Semite or a group of anti-Semites will corner you and you'll be defenseless. Now, where do we see this? We see this in France. Just recently, the group of students who, it wasn't a Jewish teacher, but a French teacher who was teaching about civil discourse was abducted and was decapitated. Muslim students, they just went to trial and the conviction was just in the papers now. So I think in general, lo b'chayil, lo b'koach, let's live peacefully, let's have peaceful demonstrations, let's peacefully work out our disagreements with each other. But we live in a world where not everybody else lives by lo b'chayil, lo b'koach, not by might, not by power. So I think there's some rethinking of this Haftarah. By the way, I think I am one of probably 1,000 rabbis this morning who are looking at this Haftarah and wondering, is there some rethinking to do?